Welcome to another episode of Profiles in Purpose. Today, my guest is Amber Murray. She has extensive knowledge, particularly in the area of environmental issues, including land development and water protection. And I really want to get to know where her passion comes from and her background that has provided her with the knowledge and experience and really the sense of purpose that she gets from these issues. Thank you for joining me today, Amber.
Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
And I should also mention we're currently in April 2025. There is a federal election campaign underway, and she does happen to be at the moment a Green Party candidate. So I should definitely mention that. And she resides in Lethbridge, which is in the southern part of Alberta. I understand you've lived there since about 2023. Can you tell me what brought you to Lethbridge and a little bit about that area?
We were actually living in BC up to 2015. And if you know anything about BC, that was right after the housing market, or right at the beginning of the housing market boom. And we had, such as BC, we had a great little spot in Nelson with a very, very high mortgage. And my husband's multinational communications company or national communications company was sold. And he was one of the last folks in the tech department to receive a pink slip, essentially. And we knew that we had two choices to either become what's called the Kootenai nightmare, where you want to stay in the Kootenai so bad because you love it, but you end up not being able to afford it. And it really impacts your lifestyle there, where you're working all the time, you can't afford your home, you can't afford food, that kind of thing. Or we could take our nest egg and
Mm.
move home. And we ran back home. And we're both from Calgary originally. And I have a great set of in-laws, and they invited us to come and stay with them. And then I was actually homeschooling my son through the transition.
Hmm.
And my husband was just looking for work because he'd had a really good salary. He'd gone through several different companies and he wanted to get in on that salary level. He wanted to stay current. And he actually got a job down in McGrath
Mm.
with a company. It was an online company called surex.com, which was a brokerage. He got in with their tech department and they've been fabulous. But we went down for the interview and the town was so pretty. It was so pretty. So we just lost our whole life and all of our friends and everything in Nelson. And then we got this little picturesque town down south. And so we rented a place down there. And then a house came up for sale that compared to BC prices was just outrageous.
Mm.
And we decided to get it, and it had about an acre of land around it. And I designed and built basically a small resiliency project, a farm
Mm.
that could support a family. And also, I could sell some of the goods into the community. So I had several thousand square feet of annual beds. I had water capture. I had chickens. I had bees. I had hay fields around the outside. And we ended up being down there for almost 7 years. And our child is a gifted artist and academic and musician. And we wanted to
Mm.
get to a bigger school. I wanted to get back into the city, get back into environmental work, get back into politics, get back into
Hmm.
community associations. And we wanted to downsize our house. It was really big for the three of us. And so we got a little place in Lethbridge and moved here in the fall of 23. Kids started in grade 10, and everything's been just hunky-dory since.
Oh, good.
And yeah, that's how I ended up here. This community, Southside Lethbridge, really reminds me of Uphill in Nelson. Lots of old houses, lots of big trees. It's a jewel of canopy and just little old houses and really, really tight community associations, people that are
Yes.
that are involved in their community. So that's how we ended up in Lethbridge and
Hmm.
back in Alberta. We're Albertans that left and tried to make a go of it in BC and then came home when things got tough. We came
Yes.
back to the prairies. And that's how we ended up here and how I ended up doing environmental work. It's less about being an environmentalist and more about being a landscape designer and a landscaper. Having lived here in both BC, where water was quite plentiful and clean, and then coming here and dealing with irrigation water and especially in the last few years, continual shutdown because there wasn't enough water and the dryness and the differences. It's very interesting, the differences of growing techniques that you have to do in order to have successful crops here as opposed to BC. BC, you throw seeds in the air and you get a crop.
Mm.
but at least where we were. But here you have to be pretty careful about it. You have to really look at moisture loss. And then the reason that I've gotten involved politically is because our provincial government is interested in monetizing our eastern slopes and all the headwaters of southern Alberta's water and the South Saskatchewan basin that goes all the way through to Manitoba by putting in coal, which is a very thirsty business and it's also a very dirty business.
Mm,
And there's so many people opposed to it and so many people worried about it because our only water source in Lethbridge is the Old Man River and
mm,
its headwaters are in Grassy Mountain. They're in the area where they want to put coal mines. So
mm.
that's how I got involved. I literally felt drawn to this, that I had to stand up and do it. And there's lots of folks on all sides of the political spectrum that don't want me here.
Hmm.
It's fine, but we're just trying to build a movement, an environmental movement that concentrates on political pressure. It's kind of how I got into this.
Can you talk more broadly about the issue of water? Obviously, water is a huge issue for agriculture and developing countries, the access to clean water and the connection to climate change. Now, that's a huge question, but just in general, how around the world is climate change affecting access to water for farmers and for ordinary folks? And why is it something that we should all be concerned about?
Well, certainly we're seeing really unusual weather patterns.
Mm,
So, with these unusual weather patterns, there's a lot of regions that are either stuck in a prevailing drought cycle or they're stuck in a prevailing flood cycle.
mm,
Often these things are related, but what we're seeing is flood will affect clean water, right?
mm,
Because you have water treatment plants and sewages that are overflowing, and then you can't drink the water and they can't treat it. They have to wait for it to clean out. And then with drought, we just don't have the quantity of water. So the concentration of pollutants that come into the water are typically the same, but then with the decrease in quantity, you find that that has more prevalence. The pollutants in the water will have more
mhm,
prevalence. And then there's always the economic issue. And this is always the economic issue is
mm,
that the environment has a long-term revenue positive, but it's an initial investment and it's often a significant investment. And what we're finding with the prevalence of discussions around economy and particularly in Canada, gross domestic product, is that that is always going to take precedent
mm,
over investing. So I find that we still haven't cleaned up all of our water sources or all of the water sources for First Nations, which was an agreement and a promise made by the Liberal government way back in 2015. They still haven't done it. And I think that's the real lost opportunity. It's something that we should have invested in.
mm,
But it seems like powerful corporations and wealthy individuals have put so much pressure on government right now to decrease taxes and give tax incentives to corporations that are offering employment. But those tax deductions are actually putting a lot of pressure on the working class
mm,
and on the ability of environmental groups and advocates to make a statement and to be part of the conversation. So I
mm,
think for me, I find that if it doesn't make money, a lot of governments don't want to talk about it. And
mm,
wealth inequity is increasing all around the world. And folks who are in the upper echelons of wealthy people, they just don't want to invest.
mm,
They want to make the money. They don't want to invest the money, it seems like. It's always going to cost,
mm.
right now anyway, but the costs are going to be exorbitantly higher down the road, I think. Yeah.
Right. Now, I'm always intrigued by what draws people to causes that are, bigger than themselves and that give them that sense of purpose. So, can you back up a bit and just tell us a bit about how aware were you of these kinds of issues when you were, when you were a kid or a teenager or first going to your first post-secondary institution? Like, when did these issues start to become very prevalent in your mind?
I grew up in Chestermere, Alberta, which is actually quite a thriving city now. But when I was there, it was just houses around a lake. And the lake was really just a widening of the irrigation canal in that area. My best friend lived down at the end of the lake, and I lived they lived down at the south end of the lake, and I lived at the north end of the lake.
Hmm.
So when I'd go to visit them, I'd have to ride my bike to their house. And I found that along one side of the road, there was a huge vegetable farm. It must have been about 10 acres. And they had workers from Southern Asia for sure. They had agricultural hats that they wear that are so great. They're like umbrellas for your whole body.
Hmm.
And I was fascinated by this place. I would stop and look. Every time I would ride down, I would just stop and watch them work. And I was amazed by the rows and rows and rows of vegetables. And this was before I think the real side, and I say side, CIDE, took over in agriculture. This was before pesticide, herbicide, fungicide, insecticide became so prevalent in production of agriculture.
Hmm.
So I was always into growing and I was always into my friends were all farm kids and I was always into their barns and their cows and their horses and all kinds of stuff. So I was always really drawn to be on the land. And I think environmental concerns really started to mean something to me when I lived in Banff, Alberta, because I
Hmm.
lived there for a long time.
Hmm.
And my first real step into environmentalism was campaigning against the grizzly bear hunt up there.
Hmm.
And it was like nobody knew these things were happening. These decisions are made in closed rooms by governments that think that they can make some money on it. It's always about the money, right? About trophy hunting and that kind of thing. And virtually every door I knocked on in Canmore and Banff, that people were like, wait a second, we hunt grizzly bears?
Hmm.
And I would say, I know, right? Like, and so it was no problem getting that petition done and getting it in. And then when you live in a national park, I also worked on the golf course at the Banff Springs there. And I had a superintendent who was very odd in his field. And we actually grew and maintained a 36-hole course. 18 of those holes were world-class holes with agronomy and cultural techniques and no pesticides or sprays at all in a national park. And I've met people here in Lethbridge who still talk about him in the pejorative and talk about him like he was a crazy person. And I
Hmm.
was like, I can't even believe it. Like, that's the narrative that comes out of it. That's the narrative that gets placed on people who are concerned and trying to make positive changes for the environment. So definitely my time in Banff was part of it. My husband and I were when we lived in Calgary, commuted by foot and by bike. We were both human powered. What do you call it when you go to work?
Commuters, yes.
Yeah, we were human powered commuters. Thank you,
Yes.
thank you. I haven't finished my coffee, but yeah, so we've always been keen on it. But I tell you, those fires didn't start like the real concern. The real fear and concern didn't start until about 2015. We
Hmm.
were living in BC, and that was the first real summer of fires. And we
Hmm.
could watch them from our deck. And we had ash coming down. I worked with people who literally stayed up all night and watched the flames. They just waited for people to come get them out of their houses. Like
Hmm.
it was scary. And when you live in the Kootenays there's only three ways out, right? So everybody had a bag packed by the door. And I mean, some of the discussions with your kids are what books do you want to take? You can't take the Hunger Games because they weigh like 19 pounds.
Hmm.
You know what I mean?
Hmm.
But anyway, so we lived through that and then we came back to Alberta and almost immediately watered and burnt down.
Hmm.
So we've seen this over and over and it just feels to me anyway, it feels like the environment has to be part of legislative discussions at every single level. It has to start and end with we have to, if we're going to talk about the economy, then we have to talk about putting money into sustainable economy and growing that economy for the future. Because if we keep putting our money into fossil fuels and putting tax dollars into fossil fuels, not only are we not going to get the return that we want, but
Hmm.
we're also going to be saddled with cleanup costs later on,
Hmm.
right? And reparations costs. And that's just going to drive our economy, I think, and drive tax dollars in a direction that we don't want to go.
Right.
But again, I keep feeling like the environment isn't part of the discussion every single time. And I really believe that it should be. And that's why I'm involved.
Yes. And I understand what you're saying about there need to be better decisions at all levels of government, right? Local or provincial or regional, depending what country you're in, and federal. Also on the individual basis too, are there things that you do personally that if a lot more people did it too, you think would make a difference?
Yeah, we live in a 100-year-old house now. This
Hmm.
old house is practically petrified, this old sucker. And the insulation really needs to be changed. But put on a sweater and slippers in the winter, and we definitely move into the lower levels in the summer,
Mm,
right? We decrease our winter temperatures. I mean, our nighttime temperatures we set at 15, and our daytimes are at 17. And we're with NMAX for energy, and what they tell us is that we're 11% more efficient than the most efficient homes in our district.
mm,
And
mhm,
our house is not efficient.
mm,
So we've covered the windows, we cover the doors with to stop drafts, right? We make sure that we have blankets on all of the couches through the winter to keep your heating costs down and
mm,
keep your energy use down. And it's not a real hardship. Folks
mm.
know, like when our family comes to visit, everybody brings their slippers and their sweaters because we've gotten to the point where we can't sleep when it's too warm in the house. The other thing we do is we never use the dryer. We hang up our clothes. It's one of the most energy intensive things that you can do. And
Mm,
in the summer, we hang them outside. So laundry is a big deal. We use cold water laundry. We definitely shut off lights when we're not using them. And all of our bulbs have been changed to energy efficient bulbs. We actually do grow a lot of plants from seed. I grow all of my gardening plants from seed, but we have LED grow lights. So they're not like huge energy intensive lights. They
mm,
hardly make a blip. We've moved into this area so we can walk and bike to nearly everything. The only thing we can't get to by foot is our doctor. That would be
mm.
a long ride up to the west side. Everything else we can walk to. We can walk to get groceries or ride our bikes to go to the store, go to the dentist. It's just up here. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So we've arranged our lives where we don't have to use our car. And so we have a single car for our family. Recycling, we try and reduce and reuse more than anything. I haven't bought any Ziploc bags or plastic bags for probably 20 years. I do a lot of gardening, obviously. Learned how to live through the winter on root vegetables and bulbs, right?
Hmm.
So almost in every single meal through the winter are carrots and potatoes and onions and garlic. It's just a different spices and different sauces on pretty much the same vegetable, soups and that kind of thing. And we're fine. I
Yep.
make my own bread, that kind of thing. So we've kept our grocery prices down, we've kept our energy prices down, and we work really hard to be environmentally conscious and energy conscious. And I believe that if everybody worked on that, I think that we would be better off. But the long and the short of it is most people who are working class and have lower income levels live that way anyway because they have to.
Mm,
And what we're finding is that the top 5%, pretty much anywhere, just has a free-for-all. They keep their houses really warm. They run their air conditioners a lot. They have several cars. And they stopped the consumer carbon price, which was paying a lot of us. My family alone made $800 a year on it.
mm.
And we spent that money in the community, but it was the upper echelon that didn't get paid that had it shut down. And
Yeah.
again, this is where we're at again. We're always coming up against the economy and economics, but it's always a smaller group of people that has power over the large group of people. And what we find is that 75-80% of the world lives very, very environmentally conscious,
Mm,
whether they're actually
mm.
conscious of it or whether they just have to because they don't have the money to spend
Yep.
on energy. And then the upper echelons are always responsible for environmental degradation and high energy use.
And when you're talking about the more wealthy, kind of just living the life they want to live and, having their homes warm and not caring, there are even in my neighborhood some houses that are more expensive houses where they always have their exterior lights on. And I'm thinking to them that additional electricity cost is nothing. It means nothing to them. And I would never, though, leave like certain lights on like all the time because I just feel guilty about the environment. But for them, it's like it's a meaningless cost. It doesn't mean anything. But also something I wanted to get to is it's interesting to me how over time, ideas start out often as like fringe or that's too inconvenient. How unusual that someone would do that. And then over time, they just become common sense that of course you do this or of course you don't do that. And for me, one of the big benefits of travel is you see that there are other ways to live that also work, that are common sense there. Like you go somewhere like Amsterdam, you go to the train station, and there are 1,000 bikes parked outside the train station because people bike everywhere. And the
Hmm.
roads and the roads are built in a way that you can safely do that. And when I visit Slovakia, where my wife's from and where my dad was from, and then you travel across the border, which is really close to Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia. You cross over the border into Austria, and you got massive fields full of wind turbines, right? And of
Right.
course, they're utilizing the free power that's available once you make the initial investment, the free power that's available. And how many of those do we have in Alberta? We have a few. If you drive south towards Waterton, I believe you pass a whole bunch, right?
Oh,
But
yeah, I live down south. There's a
yeah,
lot of big wind farms down here.
what do you think of those? Are those, do you have mixed feelings? Are they mostly positive or?
I'm like a solar punk. I think they're cool.
Yeah, yeah.
I read a lot of science fiction and I really think they're cool. I'd like to see them more colorful. I'd like to see maybe some streamers on them. Yeah, no, I like them and I like the amount of energy they generate.
Hmm.
I know there's just the waste from them has been a big issue and it's a big talking point, but I think they're something like 98% recyclable. Like that's just an economy waiting to happen, a
Hmm.
circular economy. We have housing and we have wood shortages, and yet we have all of this material that's just sitting and waiting to be used because it's
Hmm.
been decommissioned or they've had to change it. I mean, down here, you'll see big trucks that have two, like they'll have a long flatbed with another flatbed trailer on it, carrying the big blades and they have to shut down
Hmm.
the highway so that they can
Yes,
make a big turn and go out. And it's
yes.
just one blade. They're enormous. It's crazy.
It is
But
crazy.
yeah, there's a lot of them sitting in piles just waiting to be used.
Hmm.
But that's something we could invest in, right?
Yes.
That's a circular economy that we can invest in that could perhaps build shelters for farm animals or barns or sheds,
Hmm.
recycled sheds, something that people could use, right?
Right.
So I quite like them. I know that there's an issue with solar panels and critical minerals, and that's always a concern. But trees are always an answer. Stop cutting
Hmm.
down trees. I know we don't have to use our air conditioner because we have big trees along the side of our house, and the house just doesn't get really hot in the summer, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, there's ways to manipulate your environment. There's ways to put in development for city planning. You're talking
Yes.
about city planning that involves like large boulevards with big trees. The
Yeah.
more big trees we have as the world heats up, the better off we are. Yeah.
And as you mentioned earlier, like much of the world, they do things that are environmentally friendly, for lack of a better term, because out of necessity, because they don't have a vehicle, so they walk. They have other activities that have a minimal impact on the environment because economically, that's the only way they can do things. Doesn't it seem discouraging sometimes that it's only going to be when it seems like when it's out of necessity that we'll make these changes rather than to prevent the bad outcomes? Wise prevention rather than, oh boy, we went too far. We better pull
Yeah.
back here.
Yeah. And Canada's always a really tough one because we've got a really small population, spread out along the border of Canada and the US, right?
Hmm.
And we're just so far apart.
Hmm.
We're so far apart. And I keep hearing who's going to pay for the rail, who's going to pay for this. They don't even have it in Southern Ontario, which is the most densely populated part of the country. They
Yeah.
still don't have high-speed rail down there. They're trying to get it,
Yeah.
but they still don't have it. I know Albertans here. Everybody in Alberta wants a train from Lethbridge up to Fort Mac. Everybody.
Hmm.
You wouldn't have to drive the QE2 in the winter. You could just hop on the train, right?
Hmm.
It's so much safer. But who's going to pay for that? That's always the response. Who's going to pay for that? Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
with you. I want to see investment. I want to see definitely want to see a stop to tax deductions and tax incentives for fossil fuel companies. I want to see that over. I want to see tax deductions and investment in sustainable industries and in circular industry and in nationalizing an electricity grid based on sustainable energy like wind and hydro in BC that we could exchange on. Geothermal is a big one here that we should be investing in. There's all kinds of things that we could do, and that's where our current tax dollars, I think, should be going,
Hmm.
right?
I want to come back to why these issues do you think particularly connect with you? I mean, you mentioned some of your childhood experiences and I know you've attended what, 4 or 5 undergraduate or post-secondary institutions. Is it partly that the more you become just educated, the more you become knowledgeable about these things, the more you get concerned about them? Is that sort of a byproduct a bit?
Yeah, I think so. I've taken a bunch of different, like various different things. Some of the things that I've gone to take were things like permaculture and the study of beekeeping and organic master gardener and different things like that. And I've also done straight university, a lot of liberal arts. That's my jam. I like to learn about history and anthropology and religious studies and philosophy. And I feel like the more we share our stories of the past, that's what I think really reached me and what continues to reach me.
Hmm.
One of the funny stories that I like to tell was when I was growing up in Chestermere, we had this little rickety old community center. It was a tiny old green thing. And I remember so vividly, they used to have Saturday movies for kids.
Hmm.
So all the kids in the neighborhood would go and we would watch movies. And one of them, I mean, I couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Hmm.
Right. And it scared me to death. Like, this is an old movie with, claymation. Have you ever
Hmm.
seen it?
Well, I've read the
Anyway,
book, but anyway.
and I was blown away, and
Hmm.
and it kind of stayed as a theme with me that this story written before anybody knew about giant squids, before there were ever submarines, right?
Hmm.
If we can dream it, we can achieve it,
Hmm.
right? And that's what scares me because I do read a lot of science fiction and I have studied a lot of history, and I'm just scared that we already know what's going to happen
Hmm.
if we don't start changing our ways and really investing. It's right there. It's all written for us. Some of the best minds in the world have given up their science and they've just gone to write fiction. Some of
Yeah.
the best minds in the world, they're like, I prefer to be a writer. I just want to sit in my room and tell people how I think about things in a format that they won't come and, beep down my door for, right? Like,
Yeah.
they don't want to go into politics for it, but they just want to get that message out there. And for me, it's quite plain. Like, we've been heading in that direction for a long time.
Hmm.
So yes, I definitely think education is part of it. I definitely think I'm upset because I know your family comes from Europe. I'm upset because Europe really does invest in
Hmm.
higher education at all levels, right?
Hmm.
They really support their students, and we're not doing that here. We're not supporting our students. We're not holding up our university programs. We're not really pushing minds to think about things like, what do we do with all of this leftover wind turbine stuff? And how do we make batteries that aren't going to be detrimental to our environment in the future? Those kind of things. I just don't think that the investment is there in just in thought and in study. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So yeah,
absolutely.
I'm with you. I really believe that education is a big factor of it. And I'm sad that not everybody has the opportunity to do that.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
maybe one final question for you. Can you give an example of a few things that you hope will become common sense in the next few years where, of course, we do this, or of course, we don't do that in regards to the environment? Just a few.
Well, I work with the environment Lethbridge here too, and I'm one of my big things is the tree canopy. And I would like to let people know that rock gardens aren't your answer.
Hmm.
So I hope that becomes common sense. I know it's dry here, but that's going to actually hurt your trees. They're very difficult to maintain, and we have pioneer weeds here that are meant to break rock. So
Hmm.
that's one thing that I would like to say is that it's better to mulch. It's better to mulch heavily and not walk on your beds and create beds, spaces of plants that aren't heavy drinkers in your canopy so that when you're watering those plants so that you have a nice yard, you also are watering your trees. That's one thing that I hope becomes common sense. And I hope people really recognize that fossil fuels not only resource extraction at the moment, but that what happens after, that there is a prevailing pattern of fossil fuel companies not cleaning up when they're done. So not only are we paying environmental costs at the time, but we're going to pay it after as well.
Hmm.
So giving tax incentives to that industry doesn't make any sense, not on an environmental level or an economic level. So I hope that becomes common sense as well. And I hope folks really embrace things like biking and living in that 15-minute city idea where parking lots aren't part of design anymore because we have greater tax capacity when we don't have parking lots, right?
Hmm.
Which you can put more social programs to work for,
Hmm.
because you get more tax revenue for your municipality.
Wonderful. I think those are great examples. Well, Amber Murray, I really appreciate your time today. Again, Amber Murray, she's a writer, she's a speaker, an environmental advocate, and a candidate with the Federal Green Party. And I want to thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed this.